The first thing they saw was the smoke. Not the acrid gray columns of burning villages or the black haze of collapsing cities they had grown accustomed to, but the clean, curling ribbons rising from a kitchen chimney behind barbed wire. For the women in stiff, mud-caked boots and uniforms that had lost their color, it seemed impossible that such smoke could carry the scent of meat, thick, juicy, seasoned. Hunger had trained them to distrust their own senses. The imagination could play tricks, conjuring feasts in the middle of ruin. Yet the smell lingered, undeniable, drifting over the camp like a stubborn ghost of peace. They shuffled forward, German prisoners of war captured in the last chaotic months of fighting. Nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, women who had followed armies and propaganda into a war they never fully commanded. Their minds braced for cruelty. The stories whispered among them, fueled by years of Nazi broadcasts, told them to expect iron chains, hard whips, perhaps starvation until death seemed preferable. Every step closer to the American camp gate was taken with clenched jaws and narrowed eyes. Dignity would be stripped from them, they believed, as easily as their uniforms had been. That was the script they rehearsed in silence. But the gate opened not into a dungeon, but into something disorienting. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows. A yard stretched wide and orderly. A guard tower looked down, yes, but the soldiers inside did not sneer. Instead, they pointed toward a mess hall. It was there, inside, that the real confusion began. Trays were slid into hands still trembling from captivity. On those trays lay bread, soft, white, and warm. Potatoes roasted, golden at the edges. And at the center, like some strange joke, sat a slice of steak, still steaming, the fat glistening in the light. One woman stared at hers so long that a guard asked, almost impatiently, if she planned to eat. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She had not tasted beef in months, perhaps years. In the bombed streets of Cologne, she had scavenged scraps of turnip to share with neighbors. Here, on American soil, she was handed what seemed a banquet. She whispered to the woman beside her, "It must be poisoned." The other replied, just as softly, "Then let me be poisoned first." She bit, chewed, and then began to cry. The steak was real. And the danger was not death, but disbelief. Statistics later revealed what the census confirmed that day. Each German prisoner in American custody consumed, on average, nearly 3,000 calories daily. Eggs, bread, butter, and coffee, the staples of American abundance, were served even to those who had been told by their leaders that surrender meant slavery. At home, German civilians survived on rations, sometimes barely 1,200 calories. The women knew this. They wrote letters describing meals to families who could not imagine such plenty. Some tucked crusts of bread into envelopes as proof, like relics of another world. The guards themselves were no less stunned by the arrangement. American soldiers, many still young and fresh from battle, stood in line serving food to the very enemy they had fought across the ocean. One corporal admitted to his diary that the sight was almost comic. "We fought them, and now we feed them steak better than my mother can afford." Irony sat heavy in the hall, but there was method behind the strangeness. America had signed the Geneva Convention and meant to honor it. More than that, the abundance was itself a message. Democracy did not fear, it fed. A full stomach could erode bitterness more efficiently than 1,000 pamphlets. And yet, for the women, this created a strange conflict. Gratitude clashed with suspicion. Was this kindness genuine, or a tactic to soften them, to turn them against their homeland? Each bite carried a taste of doubt. One prisoner, a former nurse barely 30, recalled years later, "I was ashamed. Ashamed that my enemies fed me better than my own country could." The steak on her tray became more than food. It was evidence that the world she thought she understood was collapsing, and not only on the battlefields. The room grew quieter with each meal. At first, trays clattered as prisoners hesitated to take them. Later, silence came from concentration, the soft rhythm of chewing, the occasional sigh of disbelief. It was not joy exactly, but a surrender of another kind, surrender to the unavoidable reality that the Americans were not playing the part written for them by German radio. These were not jailers with fists raised. They were men in aprons, ladling gravy. There were awkward laughs too. One afternoon, an older woman asked for a second helping. The soldier serving looked at her plate, shook his head, and said, "Lady, you eat like one of our farmhands." The prisoners erupted in cautious laughter, laughter they had forgotten their throats could produce. For a moment, barbed wire melted into background. The camp became a place not of punishment, but of contradiction, safety inside captivity, abundance inside defeat. Still, beneath the warmth of meals and the rhythm of camp life, tension lingered. The women wondered how long this illusion could last. Could generosity really survive war's bitterness? Could steak and bread rewrite the lessons of hatred carved into their youth? No propaganda film had ever shown this ending. The enemy, apron on, offering salt for your meat. The dissonance gnawed as sharply as hunger once had. Outside the hall, searchlights cut the night and boots still marched along fences. They were still prisoners, make no mistake. But within the walls, something subtler unfolded. Each plate slid across the counter carried not just nourishment but a question, a challenge to every certainty the prisoners had carried with them from Europe. It was one thing to survive captivity. It was another to be fed dignity on porcelain trays. And so the women ate, cautious, suspicious, yet unable to stop. For every bite they took, another layer of fear peeled back. They had expected chains. Instead, they found steak. And what unsettled them most was not the flavor of the meat, but the realization that kindness, once tasted, was harder to spit out than propaganda. They had surrendered their arms. Now, unknowingly, they began to surrender their illusions. But what came next would reach beyond hunger, beyond disbelief, and into the very core of what it meant to be conquered. The mess hall became the axis of their new world, but food was only the first surprise. Once the shock of steak and bread settled into routine, the women began to notice the other details. The shelves lined with books, the sound of typewriters tapping in corners, the strange sight of Germans and Americans exchanging words not as captor and captive but as reluctant neighbors sharing the same square of earth. The camp was a cage, yes, yet within it unfolded a life so unexpected that even whispers in the barracks carried more disbelief than complaint. They had arrived ready to endure torment. Instead they found themselves spectators in a quiet theater of American values. One of the younger nurses, her hands still rough from field dressings, spent afternoons in the camp library where battered English dictionaries sat beside German novels. She traced the words with her finger, half studying, half daydreaming. Her captors encouraged it. Classes were offered, lectures arranged. Some women learned arithmetic, others practiced English phrases. It was disorienting, less like imprisonment and more like preparation for a life they never imagined. Each lesson carried a subtext. If your enemy allows you knowledge, perhaps he does not fear you. Perhaps he sees you as human. The soldiers, too, became part of the bewildering transformation. They served meals with a casual humor, watched the prisoners play volleyball, sometimes even joined the games. There were still watchtowers, still rifles and fences, but those symbols grew oddly muted when set against the clatter of laughter echoing across the yard. For the women, this duality gnawed at certainty. How could the same country that dropped bombs over their cities now lend them sports equipment, music, even moments of levity? It was as though the walls themselves whispered a contradiction. You are defeated, but you are not despised. Numbers underscored the strangeness. The U.S. government spent roughly 80 cents per day on each prisoner, at a time when many American families struggled under rationing. Steak and butter slid across mess hall counters while civilians at home counted coffee beans and sugar cubes. Some guards grumbled that the enemy ate better than their own brothers fighting overseas. Yet the policy held firm, not out of indulgence but strategy. Feeding the enemy with dignity was cheaper than feeding hatred with brutality. A meal could win where violence failed. The prisoners, meanwhile, became witnesses to this theater of contradictions. Letters home painted images their families barely believed. Tables set with bread, radios playing American music, the smell of soap and fresh laundry. One woman slipped a crust of bread into an envelope, hoping the relic would prove her words were true. Another wrote, "We eat like kings, though we are prisoners. Do not worry." These messages, intercepted at times by censors, still carried weight across the ocean. They revealed not only the reality of captivity but the absurdity of the expectations they had carried from Europe. Yet not all emotions were so simple. Guilt mingled with gratitude. Shame tangled with relief. Sitting at a wooden table, one former secretary stared at her plate and whispered to herself, We should not eat like this while our people starve. Each bite tasted of betrayal, as though chewing steak meant chewing away loyalty. Still, hunger proved stronger than ideology. Slowly, suspicion softened into reluctant acceptance. The enemy, it seemed, had given them back their appetites. Even humor crept in, thin but undeniable. A group of prisoners joked that if the war lasted much longer, they would refuse to be exchanged back to Germany, preferring instead the bizarre comfort of their captivity. Others teased that the Americans must be fattening them up for slaughter, though their laughter betrayed that they no longer believed it. The irony was delicious. Their jailers had become their providers, their fear replaced with awkward admiration. What once sounded like cruelty now sounded like a punchline. The transformation ran deeper than appetite. Beneath the routines of meals and classes, a subtler education unfolded. These women, once saturated in propaganda that painted America as barbaric, now lived among evidence to the contrary. They saw the discipline of guards who did not strike them, the fairness of rations evenly divided, the strange civility of being addressed as Miss instead of prisoner. Each interaction chipped away at the scaffolding of lies they had carried with them across the Atlantic. The walls of the camp confined their bodies but began to liberate their minds. For some, the change was painful. To admit the enemy was kind was to admit their own side had deceived them. Yet denial weakened daily. One evening, as coffee was poured into tin cups, an older woman raised hers slightly toward the soldier serving and said, almost under her breath, "Danke." The word hung in the air heavier than any shout. Gratitude was a dangerous admission, and yet it slipped free, uncontainable. The soldier nodded without comment, but the moment echoed through the hall like the crack of a breaking wall. By the time seasons shifted, the camp had grown into something resembling a paradoxical sanctuary. These women were not free, but they were safe. They were not honored, but they were respected. And in the daily rhythm of meals and lessons, they became witnesses to a truth larger than their own captivity, that America wielded abundance as a weapon sharper than steel. Where bombs had shattered buildings, steak and coffee now shattered illusions. The prisoners had expected to be broken. Instead, they were shown a mirror of their own humanity, held up by those they once called enemies. It was this realization, not the barbed wire, that left them most shaken. For captivity could end with treaties and ships homeward. But the memory of generosity, offered in the place of vengeance, was something no release could undo. And so they ate, they learned, they watched. They bore witness to a quiet revolution of the spirit, one served not on battlefields but on dinner trays. What they did not yet know was how deeply these memories would follow them home, reshaping how they spoke of America, how they raised children, how they remembered war. For in the end, their captivity was not measured by fences or rifles, but by a question that lingered long after. What kind of enemy feeds you steak when you expect chains? Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.